Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that explains positional ideas with a particular emphasis on pawn structures that recur throughout chess practice. This will be my 14th lecture on isolated pawns and their relatives. We have covered pure isolated pawn, queen's pawn positions, then isolated pawn couples, hanging pawns, then the ram structure, the advanced isolated passed pawn, which is, the advanced isolated pawn, which is not a passed pawn. And for the last couple of lectures, we've been looking at isolated C pawns. The new plan is to finish the series on isolated pawns in the next two lectures by looking at the isolated E pawn, and then move on for a while. Isolated pawns will, of course, come up repeatedly in future lectures about all kinds of other subjects. I decided that the isolated E-pawn is more important than I realized, especially with black. I'm starting this week with white, but I think with next week I'm going to look at black, and this is a revelation to me about how many instances the isolated black E-pawn is important. It's a central pawn after all. So I'm going to skip isolated A pawns, which I mentioned before, for now. It's rather obscure, and there's always time to work them back into other lectures, or if we ever return to isolated pawns. So I'm going to split isolated E-pawns into two categories. This week I'm looking at isolated E-pawns for white, and then next week isolated E-pawns for black. So that's about it. Let's get to it. The game before you, Chamier Clerc. It's a Sicilian defense, and that's actually extremely typical isolated E-pawn territory, as you'll see. Again, we never talk about openings, or very seldom we talk about openings. Okay, so white attacks the center. He is going to play f takes e5 or something like that. And if black plays he takes f5, I imagine that would isolate the e-pawn, by the way, but I think that would probably be a very strong reply. So black doesn't do that. Black simply plays here. And then white decides to open. Now, oh, by the way, this is a game from 1881, so I think that's kind of interesting. Sicilian defense wasn't that popular, and also just this is really quite reasonable what black's doing, I think. So, and what white's doing. Okay, so white captures. He's opening up the f file, hoping to get some sort of attack. Maybe he's thinking about playing bishop g5. And at this point, black could take back, and it looks like a pretty reasonable position. Typical pawn structure. D5 is covered. But instead he plays another typical move, typical of the King's Indian, the Sicilian, some other openings. What's the point? Well, black's threatening to play moves such as bishop c5 check, maybe queen b6 check, maybe queen h4 is a very dangerous move after, say, bishop c5 check. So there are several possibilities here. When white takes time to react to that, black will get a chance to place a piece in front of the isolated e-pawn. You'll see that happen. Black needs to do something about this, so he defends against those sort of dark square threats, covers h4. And there we have it. We have an isolated e-pawn for white on an open file, which is, of course, a weakness. And we have an outpost already, a piece occupying that outpost. And just in general, as a general comment here, when we had our isolated d-pawn, we blockaded it. It wasn't always even that good. And a big advantage of an isolated d-pawn was that there were very strong files on the c file and the d file. In other words, the pawn was there, and these files were very strong for white. He also had chances to make forward outposts, not outposts, but support points by moving, say, a knight to e5, extremely active pieces. Now take a look at this for a second. This file has a certain amount of impact, so we'll give him that, but the D file is very obscure. The pieces are not active. That's the main point. Look how inactive that is. It's a bad bishop. This isn't really doing that much. The knight can't go to a support point on d5. It's covered. And that's actually pretty typical of a lot of these isolated e-pawn positions, that if the knight can either be exchanged on d5 or it can't even get there. So black's pretty happy here and can hopefully get pressure on that e-pawn. So let's just see what happens. See the difference between this and the isolated d-pawn. That's the main point. Okay, covering some nice squares. White covers some nice squares, by the way. Thinking about attacking bishop h6 kind of moves. In fact, he plays that. Who knows? Maybe black will miss checkmate. No, he found it. And white attacks the queen. Queen comes back with check. King comes over. Nothing special going on here. And then black makes a sort of interesting move. Now, offhand, I think we should say that black could probably keep some sort of advantage here since there's no serious attack on this yet, just by using that outpost. White doesn't have an outpost, he does. And one way to do that would be this. It sort of attacks that. That's one of the ideas. But it also, for example, allows him to go to e5 with the queen, which is very nice. Threatens to maybe exchange queens, threatens to win more dark squares. Black is really working on the dark squares here, and yet he has a very nice light squared bishop. He has files, b file, e file. It's not much of an advantage, but very nice, very easy to play. So let's go back to the game. In the game, black played this move, doubling pawns, and that's interesting too. So what is he doing? Well, he's going there. He wants to defend this. Now this is a little weaker without the dark squared bishop. On the other hand, this is attacked. And we still have the outpost. So let's keep going here. It's just illustrative, basically, of what an isolated pawn, e-pawn, does, and what it's not really an interesting game in and of itself, as you'll see in a second. Now, by the way, look at this bishop. Just horrendous. It's just doing absolutely nothing. And black's got it very thoroughly blockaded, like that. So white plays here. He really doesn't want to exchange queens when black has all the positional advantages, besides which he'd lose that pawn probably, or, well, maybe not, but things would not be going well. And so now black plays a very interesting move. He plays this to stop bishop d4, at least that's part of the reason. And I think that's very interesting because it gives away a huge outpost. But it also, oh, by the way, it also stops the move c5, which would be interesting. Activating these bishops a little bit, that would be kind of nice for white. But instead, bishop d4 and c5 are both stopped, which means he hasn't freed this bishop, which he'd like to do. And white has this outpost. That's the big new thing. He's got an outpost. But if you look at it, there's no knight to go there. And in fact, there's no other piece to go there. Maybe a rook eventually. It's easy to protect against that. So really the only effective outpost is black's on e5, and he has an advantage. Now I'm going to stop there because the play in this game actually deteriorated. But you can see that white is completely restricted by his inability to drive black away from the crucial outpost here, the e5 outpost. So we'll just move on to another example, but that gives you sort of the basics, the starting point, and we will move on now. Okay, here we have a game where white is very low rated compared to his opponent, approximately 500 points lower, and we'll see what happens here. Another Sicilian. There aren't many e-pawn. As I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture, there aren't that many e-pawn, isolated e-pawns that come up sort of naturally. There's some e4, e5 ones, and there's some Sicilian ones, but it's not a typical thing until way later in the game. And I want to show you sort of typical structures because that's how we learn the most. Okay, standard sort of Sicilian moves, right? There we go. There's that f4 attack again. Standard. Maybe a little early, actually, in this case. And a new way now. He does take it this time. And what does this mean? Well, that pawn looks attacked, doesn't it? And that's an isolated pawn. So we have a new situation here. We have the isolated e pawn, but it's facing the isolated d pawn. Just like our isolated d pawn faced the isolated c pawn in previous lectures when we had the isolated c pawn. So both sides have what? Outpost, open files, and whatever. White has the more advanced d5 outpost. That's always good to have an outpost that's more advanced. On the other hand, his pawn is on the 4th rank where it's more vulnerable. Black's is on the 3rd rank where it's more easily defended. White has pretty decent files. The d file and the f file are nice and open. Black has pretty decent files. The e file can put pressure on that isolated pawn, and the c file is famous in the Sicilian and has obviously nice scope. So what else? Black's bishop on e7 defends that's called the bad bishop defending the good pawn. It's a bad bishop, but you're protecting a center pawn. And white's situation is very similar. He's got a center pawn on e4 that looks pretty vulnerable, and this bishop might end up defending it. Even though it's a bad bishop, it'll be defending a good pawn. So let's just continue along here. Naturally, both sides make moves. Okay, queen d2. A typical setup here, just to show you, would be something like this. Not that different from the game, but I wanted to show this to you. King moves out of the way, takes over the file. Very natural moves. White sort of gravitates to the king side. You may have seen. It also sets up rook d1. Black takes over that outpost. And the point here in the Sicilian is that whenever you take that, you're giving up your good bishop. covering these very vulnerable dark squares and freeing that bishop to come out somewhere. Maybe at some point c5, but in any case you've freed all of black's pieces. That's usually a disaster unless you have a specific idea. So knight e5 is very safe in terms of it being taken, and it has great scope. It's a blockading knight. White has not yet put his knight on d5, which would be a blockading knight. Okay, so after knight e5, white might play, for example, that move, open file, threatening bishop takes e5, and black might play this cute little move. And that illustrates the real point against this isolated e-pawn. We want to occupy the square in front of it, and e5 is a monster square generally in the Sicilian. It defends this square. It can come back and defend here. It has great influence on the position. And of course d5 for white is a monster square because it enters the position even more thoroughly, although it doesn't defend as easily. It doesn't come back and defend as many squares as the knight on e5 does. So the King's Indian also, you'll find e5 is a monster square. So some position like this, we could probably stop there. Probably white comes back into the center now in order to hit that square and maybe hit here. We'll talk about that. Very similar to the game. He doesn't want to play knight takes e6 here. Why? Because well, let's just make a silly move. I don't know if it's silly or not, but let's make a sort of random move and just look at that position for a second. Now black has a central majority. Now it's kind of a weird majority. It doesn't look that great. But unless you can attack that weak pawn or fairly weak pawn on e6, it stops knight d5. So black still has his outpost in front of the isolated pawn, but white no longer has an outpost. So taking on e6 is generally not all that desirable. Let's go back to the game. No, same idea. Takes over that square. This time white decides to go queenside. Obviously very risky. Black could even play a5, a4, get an attack going, but he plays a typical Sicilian move, and white tries to start a counterattack. And again, we're just going to look at a little excerpt here. Okay, again, he puts the knight there. Very, very nice, covering that. He might also at some point play a rook here. He doesn't, I don't think in this game. Well, we don't get that far. In order to pressure this pawn, even though it looks very indirect, all these are pieces after all. They're not pawns, so eventually you can get e-pawn pressure. The other idea, of course, is he's going to go like that, drive away the defender of the e-pawn. The other thing he's going to do is just attack. White's trying to attack on the king side. The real problem for white is it's a little bit slow. And now we talked about not taking that piece. That still applies. It's kind of a cute little idea. If he takes, black's going to be threatening rook takes followed by bishop takes, winning the queen, I think. Anyway, total side point. So we're threatening maybe knight c4 in some cases. Here we go. No, this is nothing that special. White has he has that f5 square. He's got some attacking chances. His king's pretty safe in the long run. He's probably able to, maybe not in the long run, but so maybe I'd give black a little advantage. He has some attacking prospects on the queen side. He's a little sort of better coordinated, but it's no big deal. Okay, I'm going to just stop there because that's the point of looking at this, is just as a sort of position and an example. So let's move on to the next game. Okay, here we go, and we're looking at isolated e-pawns. Yet again, another Sicilian. I'll tell you, e4, e5 comes up with some of these, but not as many. Okay, just moves. Typical Sicilian in some ways. Ah, very slow move. Kind of odd to force that exchange. Gives black a nice lead in, well, development and just positional advantages here. Attacks the c-pawn. He's covering these squares here, for example, in front of the doubled pawns. We talked a lot about doubled c-pawns. So maybe the first prejudice here is that black's doing pretty well. On the other hand, there's a little bind with those center pawns. We've seen those doubled pawns do very well also for white. Okay, so white starts attacking, and he's left with a kind of mediocre bishop so far. But black's isn't so good either at this point, and in fact, there we go, the key move, very basic Sicilian move played again and again and again. What's going to happen here? If he takes it, there's going to be an isolated e-pawn if he takes back that way. If he doesn't take it, black might take it and get an isolated e-pawn on an open file. So white's pretty much getting stuck with an isolated e-pawn. On the other hand, what's happened here with black? Well, he's given up a big outpost here, and he's given up a kind of awkward square there that can be a good attacking square. So it's just a trade-off. But it's probably nice to get some positional advantages here in a position where white doesn't have too many pieces to attack with. So he tries that. There are other ways to play this. We'll just stick with that. And black's now got a good bishop. That's important. Nice open bishop. White has a good bishop. Nice open bishop. So it's the opposite of some of our other examples. And of course white has an outpost on d5. Black's already occupied his outpost on e5. So white's a long ways from occupying it, but a knight could theoretically get there, a rook can certainly get there, a queen can get there. So this is a better outpost than the one we just saw. Okay, let's see what happens. White protects his pawn, which is hanging. Black attacks it. White attacks the queen. Black maybe wants to put a little bit of pressure here. He pins the knight. He unpins the knight and attacks that weak pawn. And it's too late. White can't put a knight on d5, which is what he'd like to do at this point. So instead he has to take it, and that's not really what he wants. Now this is attacked, so obviously he's going to take with the rook. And here we have something else here. We have the same situation, isolated pawn versus isolated pawn. But in this case, we see that sometimes you don't have to get fancy. You don't just have to occupy outposts and goof around. You can simply win pawns. So it turns out that the e4 pawn is weaker than the d6 pawn, and guess what? Black's going to just double on the file, and pretty soon he's going to just take that. And it turns out that there's nothing really white can do about that. He can counterattack, it's just that it doesn't really work. So he attacks that first. There's a problem with this. For example, it'd be nice to counterattack the d pawn, but then he runs into this, and that's defended. And he's lost the most important pawn on the board, and all kinds of things going on. So he really is doomed here in terms of his pawns. He's actually going to lose a pawn. He tries this, and that's attacked again. And it's attacked 3 times. It's going to be lost, isn't it? So he does what he can. Maybe he tries to get a little attack going. And black's a pawn up with a very solid position. He has a nice, this is an outpost actually, or at least it's not able to be driven away. This is weak. Really white's attack is looking pretty fakey. Black's well developed. And he wins another pawn, tries a little trick, but the problem is check, and he just ruined that little idea. Because now, for example, if he plays here, we have this check, and it's true that white's on that, but unfortunately white's not on that one. So that game was over quickly, and had a lot to do with blockading the isolated pawn. And what I wanted to show you is sometimes one side simply wins one of these 2 pawns. And the e-pawn can often fall in the Sicilian, can simply fall, because it's just attacked too many times and can't be defended. Okay, let's move on to the next game. Okay, here we have another Sicilian. 2 low-rated players, but that's kind of fun sometimes. Look at what lower-rated players are doing. They certainly understood what they were doing in this game pretty well. A little con variation, all sort of standard stuff. I should say, never mind, I won't say that. Okay, this is sort of a modern way to play it for black, or one of the modern ways. Okay, just moves. We're not studying openings. Now we're looking for that e5 move again. And he plays it. Okay, now what's the idea here? Well, for one thing, if white takes, then black gets to get rid of his weakness and open a file. Probably pretty happy. Might play this move, as he did in the other game, and then threaten knight f2 check and queen h4. I guess that's a little more likely, isn't it? What else is going on? If white plays by, which looks very natural, one thing black can do is simply stop the most important move, bishop g5, and then I don't think white's going to be able to stop this for very long. Maybe not even one more move. So it's going to be very difficult for white to do anything particular here. Maybe it's just equal, but it's not. Doesn't look too desirable. There's also the idea of just playing b5, bishop b7, getting pressure on that e-pawn, b4, that kind of stuff. So f5, which is often quite a good move, doesn't seem to be the right thing to do here. So he just develops. And black comes and threatens knight f2 check, maybe queen h4. White stops queen h4. We've seen this idea before. Black takes, and guess what? He takes over that little outpost. Could have done it maybe with the other knight. Could have brought both knights to attack that square. Didn't have to necessarily do it voluntarily, but looks pretty good. So white works on the file. That makes so much sense. White has this nice outpost here. So we have the same this versus this thing. So far we've seen black doing well, but that's maybe worth thinking about, that in the Sicilian a lot of times it's easier to play black in this kind of structure. This knight on e5 tends to be really good. The knight on d5 is great, of course, but a lot of times it can be exchanged off more easily because maybe there aren't two knights that can support that square, whereas here black has two knights. And also sometimes his bishop is well placed on e5, sometimes a rook. It's a little easier to replace that outpost, probably because it's on the 4th rank instead of the 5th rank. Okay, so black does a very logical thing. He just brings the rook over to attack. Now, black doesn't always attack on the Sicilian, on the king side and the Sicilian, but look, that's a piece that makes a little bit of a difference. So it kind of makes sense for him to try and do something over there. White finally tries to get rid of that bishop. And he does, but of course his dark squares are weak. And getting rid of that's going to be harder now without a bishop. So I think we kind of like black here. And that's an interesting move. He uses the outpost as a springboard. He takes one piece away and then he's going to put the other piece there. And he does it. So he's still trying to attack on the king side. It makes sense, really. Now he's got the bishop free. And it's just a little awkward for white. I really like white's pieces. He does a good thing now. He takes over an outpost. Makes sense. And black tries to get rid of it. See, black does have that option of just playing bishop takes, after which it's still impossible to dislodge that guy. So he may do that. So white avoids that possibility. Black moves over to attack this pawn. White decides he better not let that happen. And black takes over the c file. So everything's very natural. Maximum activity. He could also play something like queen b6. Every one of black's pieces is looking pretty good here, isn't it? And white hasn't succeeded in taking over d5, so what he does in fact is he allows black to cover d5, and black has large positional advantage. Brings another piece out. A lot of scary stuff going on around that queen there. So it's a big positional advantage, and we'll just sort of watch what happens now. We're not going to make a big point of it. This is the execution more than it is the positional principle. So black's got a lot of pieces kind of hanging around that king there. And there's the queen and the rook sort of hanging up. Okay, walk out of that pin. Think about playing ace takes g, but he just lets him do that. Okay, because there's problems down here. Okay. Just moves. Black's happy with his positional thing. He wants to stop b4. May not have to do that, but white goes back again. He doesn't know what to do. Black grabs some more dark squares there. That's kind of interesting. And there he goes. He decides to play a combination. So at this point, if king takes, you have queen takes h3, which is deadly. And if queen takes, you have this move. That was his point. Pretty well played for a lower rated player. I will have him here as 1663. Not bad at all. So now there's no way to stop from losing the queen. And that happens. I could show you the rest of the game. It's true that white doesn't have, black doesn't have overwhelming material, but the king is exposed too, as well as having this great, and this bishop's still horrible. So there's still an attack, and once the queen's off, this is going to be attacked. There's a lot of things being attacked. It's very hard to hold on to your material here. So that game was kind of cute and worked very well, and we'll move on to another one. Okay, now we have some very respectable top level 2650 plus players. One of them just played the candidates matches. Top Mamedyarov has been ranked way up in the world, number 4 at least. I think number 3 actually. So this is a more serious game in some ways. We're going to look at a different kind of opening. Maybe a little introduction to next week, where we're going to be looking at a bunch of King's Indians. But it goes with this week because it's white that's going to end up getting the isolated pawns. Okay, we're not going to worry about this too much. We're just making moves here. That's very interesting because these are all pretty natural moves. And very early on, white makes that retreat. Black develops. Okay, both sides are developed. And white makes an interesting move here. He just decides to sort of double, protect this square, and get ready to maybe double rooks, blah, blah, blah. And black plays a very natural move here. Well, if you've played a lot of these positions, which is sacrificing the exchange. So that is a material win for white. And interestingly, the annotations of this game that I saw, which are pretty old, seem to think that this is just giving up too much and that whites should be better, but then it doesn't really illustrate that in the game. So black attacks that weakness. I don't know if you understand this guy. You've got an outpost here on e4 for a piece, probably a knight, and these pawns can't move up without, well, just being taken. So he has a lot of compensation for the exchange here. There could be a knight going to g4. If white stops that, his pawn on g3 is weak. This bishop's pretty active. So this is a pretty typical exchange sacrifice. But right now, he's attacking this pawn down here, and black should probably just defend it. But he plays a very aggressive move. Typical. And white takes that, and this was probably a mistake. It turns out, now there's some strange things with bishop b2s. There's some strange tactics going here, but it turns out that white actually could take that pawn. So maybe black kind of timed things wrong here. It's a long story, but white comes out a little bit better there. But he's worried about various tactics, so he doesn't play that. And from now on, black seems to be getting good play regardless. Effectively, once he can defend that pawn, he doesn't really care about much else because that's so weak. Okay. This is an exchange sacrifice. It doesn't apply completely. Oh, by the way, I should say, once this pawn takes here, guess what we have? We have isolated doubled pawns. No longer backward pawns. We have doubled isolated e-pawns, and that's sort of a theme, the e-pawn. This time doubled with an outpost right in front of it, and actually another nice place to put a knight there. Two squares that can't be attacked by white's pawns. So white has a nice outpost on d4 here, but if you look at the overall situation, I don't think you're going to be very happy here. Because basically, if you look at it, let's just make one more move for white here. Well, knight e4 is a huge move, so white tries to stop that. And if you look at this position for a second, it's a fairly necessary position, move to play. These guys are very cramped, and what's on the king side? These are really cut off. This is Kasparov's slice the board in half theory. That you can attack on you slice the board in half and then you attack on the side that isn't defended. And sure enough, rather than just continual to pound down the e-file, starts a second front, our favorite theme, second front attacks. So by now, I don't know, I think white's in really bad shape. That's just my feeling. That was one of the reasons of knight d2 was just to cover. The real problem is these heavy pieces aren't getting over to defend. You know, the light pieces, they're defending okay, but okay, there we go, attacking directly, activating the bishop, and there it goes, attacking that side of the board. Now we have two sets of doubled pawns, doubled isolated pawns. Of course, white is materially ahead, but you can see there's some problems here. Simply gets the other knight on that outpost and makes a nice little move. The idea is to take here, simply to take here. And that's a killer move if you can get that far. All of a sudden everything starts collapsing. One thing you can take here and then take here is a problem. So at this point, I think white should play rook takes a6. I still think black's better, but he actually allows, he actually just covers e2. And the problem is now those squares are covered out on that side of the board. He comes back to try and win that pawn, obviously a dangerous pawn, but he sort of runs out of time. Now this is attacked, and white plays one last sort of mediocre move. Nice little picture actually if you look at this. It's a kind of a cute little double pawn sort of picture. And that's just tactically bad, but really he was in terrible shape anyway. Because now this is attacked, and this is going to be attacked, as you'll see in a second. Nice move, little retreating move. Hardest moves to find, attacking h3, and there's nothing much that white can do about it. And this pawn is still a bother. He's going to have to recover that pawn. So while he does that, black breaks through on the king side. Look at all the pieces over there, and white's pieces still aren't getting over to that side of the board. They're like blocked off by that wall. Even this guy's not getting over there. So he tries to defend. I don't think knight g5. Well, it's probably just as good as anything. Black plays here, and it's all over. This is a checkmate coming. There's really nothing to do here. So, and you can look that over just to guarantee that. So that was a little different. Those were backward e-pawns that weren't isolated, but then once white took here, they became isolated. But it's the same principle. Put a piece in front of it. This time you gave up an exchange for it, but they were particularly bad pawns. They were particularly terrible, and they cut off the defense. White had to do something early on before this got too strong. It's a good lesson just in terms of the exchange, that sacrificing the exchange these days is very, very common. That particular sacrifice is a very old one, actually. It's been around for a long time. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, it was, I think, very strong, except for that one possibility of it taking there. And I think black should have anticipated that, because he should have been in no real hurry. So even though I didn't stop to criticize one of those moves, you might look back and see what happened there. Okay, this has been Beyond the Opening. Next week we come back and we're going to look, instead of white isolated eplons, we're going to look at black isolated eplons, which will be quite fun. So thank you everybody for listening, and I'll be here next week.